My name is Cody Pope, and this is an assignment for oral interpersonal communication. In 1788, the first English penal colonies reached Australia's eastern shore, exposing the Aborigines to a totally different culture. Imagine the barriers that they faced between these two cultures, the reaction to hearing the first bull roarer or the haunting tunes of the didgeridoo. First, we'll talk about the Aborigines, their culture, communication systems, and tools. We will also discuss how European culture affected the Aboriginal culture and their communication practices. First, we'll talk about the Aboriginal culture. The culture of the Aborigines is a hard topic because, like our own country, where we have the Creek, the Fox, the Sioux, the Apaches, and so on and so forth, they have a large variety of different subsets. So it's hard to get an accurate picture of how their culture is set up, but the few core things seem to be universal. The female groups are matrilineal, which means that all the females are related, and they're a central stationary group, or a hub, if you will. And the male group is a large-ranging group that travel very, very far distances. It's unclear, because of the diversity of these different groups, of the level of equality that they had. Some researchers think that they were pretty much universally equals, or separate but equal rather. Others tend to think that they were more male-dominated. There was a practice, though, with the female groups if the males proved to be too dominating, which was called subversive retaliation. And that's basically when if the male dominating group is too dominating, they will retaliate, often up to a point where they would even perform an infanticide, where they would kill off the next generation. So it was very clear that if the males were in fact dominating, not to push their luck too far. So now that we've talked about the basic understanding of the culture, it should be easier to reach an understanding as to their different communication tools. They seem to have a core language with several different dialects, so that even though different Aboriginal groups who are very far apart still would be able to communicate more or less with some significant differences, but more or less enough where they could communicate correctly. Even between the females and the male groups in an area, there are subtle differences, mostly for the different groups to communicate in a way where the other groups wouldn't really know what they're talking about. They also had a different form of sign language, which is very interesting, because unlike our culture, where sign language is used primarily for the hearing impaired, theirs was more for speech taboos, certain times where they couldn't communicate using verbal language, like when if a female was in mourning, she wouldn't be able to talk, so she could communicate with a form of sign language. And again, a lot of different groups have a different variety of sign language. The males also used their own brand of sign language for things where they had speech taboos, like, for example, when they were being initiated into like adulthood or into a certain group where they wouldn't be able to communicate. Interestingly enough, The deaf in an Aboriginal culture didn't really have a specific language to use. Their sign language was very basic and only used pretty much for their friends and family so that they could communicate with them. And it was a very personal kind of thing. They also did not have a written language, which we'll talk about a little later. We mentioned didgeridoos. It turns out that this isn't really used as a language tool so much as a ceremonial tool or a cultural tool, but it is very important when performing their sacred rites and their sacred ceremonies. They would always be playing the didgeridoo. So even though it's not so much a form of communication, it is definitely a valuable tool for their culture. When they wanted to communicate long distances, what they would actually use is a bull roarer, which is it's about a foot long, oval shaped piece of wood to a string. And when they whipped it around, the designs on the wood would make this roaring sound that could be heard for very far distances. If you've seen Crocodile Dundee, there's a pretty good scene in there where you can kind of see how something like that would be used to communicate long distances, because the men were rather nomadic. They also, if they needed to convey something very detailed, would use what's called a message stick. And it's basically a stick that is pictures drawn on it, but we want to specify that they would not pictographs or a written language. These pictures were only used to remind the messenger what the message was, and they would change from time to time. They weren't a constant like pictographs or a written language. The Aboriginal culture and communication systems were very diverse before the European settlers arrived, and they were impacted, as we'll soon find out, after a brief history lesson through the arrival of the Europeans. In 1606, a ship named the Duifken, piloted by a Dutchman named Willem Janszoon, first arrived in Australia to an at that point unknown island, and that's what they named it. They named it Terra Australis Incognita, and so you can kind of see Australis, Australia, that's where it got its name, because it was unknown in the Southern Sea. About 2 centuries later, and roughly 54 merchant ships later, the English decided to start colonizing. Around 1770, they first laid claim to the eastern coast, thanks to a captain by the name of James Cook. So by 1788, the first settlers were finally established. They introduced the written language, and by introducing the written language, a lot of that sign language, that very unique personal sign language, started to reach extinction. I believe there's only a couple of sign language techniques left, but most part they no longer use their their ceremonial sign language. Also, you see a rise in the male domination of the culture, which was introduced to the Europeans, or by the Europeans. The impact of European arrival is clear. The English settlers and the Dutch merchants had a large impact on the Aborigines, most significantly the introduction of a written language, which was far superior to their long-distance communications at the time. A lot of their diverse language systems started to fade away with the more universal system. Now they still have their verbal communication system, that's the same. Overall, we see how even a most isolated, unless you are a most isolated culture, that any culture you come into contact with is going to influence your culture. And I think that's the biggest thing to take away from this. So I thank you for your time.